Assalamualaikum my dear aimers, hope so you all are doing well. I am Ariba Nadeem and the topic we are going to study today is cystic fibrosis. So let's start the topic. Firstly, I'm going to tell you what is the nature of this disease. Cystic fibrosis is basically an autosomal recessive disorder. It means that if mother and father both are the carriers, then this disease will be transmitted to our children. For example, this one, for example, if there is a daughter, then this is small c. Suppose this is for cystic fibrosis gene, and then this is again small c. So both are the recessive. So this disease, it means that this daughter is a cystic fibrosis patient. Okay, it means that one gene has come from mother and the other gene has come from father. It means that both the mother and father were the carriers of this disease. Okay, now it is an autosomal recessive disorder. Now we will talk about what is the mutation that is causing this cystic fibrosis disease. So it is basically a gene which gets mutated, and this gene causes a disease which is named as cystic fibrosis. This gene is basically called as cystic fibrosis transmembrane regulator. Simply you may call it as CFTR gene. This gene is basically responsible for synthesizing CFTR protein. As you know that genes are responsible for synthesizing proteins, so this gene will synthesize CFTR protein. Now I'll talk about the normal biochemistry of this protein. How does it work? So this is CFTR protein, and this CFTR protein basically it's a carrier protein. You know, there are carrier proteins present in cell membrane which are responsible for transport of substances. So this is a carrier protein, and this protein basically it's a carrier protein for chloride ion. So it acts as a chloride channel. Okay, so suppose here we have a cell membrane, and this cell membrane is carrying a carrier protein which is called as CFTR protein, or you may call it as a chloride channel protein or a chloride channel. Okay, so this basically what does the CFTR protein or chloride channel does is, you know that chloride is abundant outside the cell. This is intracellular fluid and this is extracellular fluid. Okay, this chloride is abundant outside the cell. So suppose there are so many chloride channels outside the cell, while there are so less chloride channels inside the cell. But what does this CFTR does is that this CFTR does active transport. It's an ATP dependent carrier protein. It does active transport, and it transports the chloride ions from inside of the cell to the outside of the cell. Okay, why does this chloride channel do like this? Basically, in case of respiratory tract or digestive tract, you know that the cells are lined with mucus. Okay, so that any germ which gets entry into the respiratory tract or your digestive tract, the germ gets entrapped into the mucus, and then that germ is expelled out from the system. So what does this CFTR protein do is that it actively transports chloride from inside of the cell to the outside of the cell. Here we have a cell membrane, and outside the cell here we have a layer of mucus. So this is basically mucus. When chloride is transported from inside of the cell to the outside of the cell, water also follows the ions. So water also moves out of the cell into this mucus, and it makes this mucus thin. Okay, so basically chloride channel is responsible for making this mucus thin. Why this mucus is present over here? Because this mucus protects the lining of the respiratory tract, your digestive tract. Okay, so what have I told you till now? That this chloride acts as a chloride channel. Chloride Cl negative moves out of the cell, and water also follows. Water also moves out of the cell, and what happens is that the mucus which is lining these tracts, that will become thin, and we have to make this mucus thin. Okay, it's normal to have a thin mucus. Okay, so the mucus becomes thin. Now what happens in case of cystic fibrosis? In case of cystic fibrosis, the CFTR gene is mutated. What does mutation mean? That there is a change in the nucleotide sequence of the gene. So whenever there is change in the nucleotide sequence of the gene, it means that gene is defective. So maybe the chloride CFTR protein is not produced at all, maybe it is not produced in sufficient amount, or maybe it does not work properly. So all these conditions may lead to cystic fibrosis. What happens that the CFTR gene is defective and CFTR protein is not produced. When CFTR is not produced, it is not produced sufficiently, then chloride ions don't move from inside of the cell to the outside of the cell. And water does not move from inside of the cell to the outside of the cell. As a result, this mucus becomes thick. So what happens in case of cystic fibrosis? That mucus which is lining the digestive tract, respiratory tract, that mucus becomes thick. This CFTR protein also has some effect on sodium channels. Whenever there is defective CFTR, then it causes hyperactivation of sodium channels. You know that sodium channels are also present in cell membrane. Sodium is abundant outside the cell. Okay, so there is so many sodium outside of the cell, and there is less sodium inside of the cell. What does sodium channel do is, sodium channel is responsible for the transport of this sodium from out of the cell to inside of the cell. Okay, and water again follows the ions. So water also moves from out of the cell to inside of the cell. Eventually this mucus becomes more thick when water also moves inside of the cell. Let me revise it again for you. There was the presence of chloride channel in the cell membrane, and there was a lining of mucus outside the cell. This chloride is transported out of the cell and actively transported out of the cell with the help of this chloride channel, which is basically a CFTR carrier protein. When the chloride moves out, water also follows the ions, and water also moves out of the cell, making this mucus thin. Whenever there is defective CFTR gene, there is defective CFTR carrier protein, so there is defective chloride channel. Cl negative does not move out of the cell. Okay, when Cl negative does not move out of the cell, water also does not move out of the cell, and this mucus becomes thick. Whenever there is defective CFTR protein, it also causes hyperactivation of the sodium channels present in the cell membrane. When sodium channels are hyperactivated, sodium channels transport the sodium from out of the cell to inside of the cell. Sodium is more abundant outside and sodium is less in inside. Sodium channel passively transports sodium from out of the cell into the cell. Water also again follows the ions, and water moves from out of the cell to inside of the cell. Again this mucus becomes thick, and this thick mucus condition is termed as cystic fibrosis. Now what does this thick mucus do? This thick mucus basically affects some of the important organs. This mucus is basically important in lungs. Let me write over here. It is important in lungs. It lines pancreas, pancreatic duct, and it is present in testes, and it is present in sweat glands. Now what happens? Whenever there is thick mucus, the most important concern for us is lungs and pancreas. Whenever there is thick mucus, you know the cilia are present in bronchus. So lungs contain cilia in its bronchus. Whenever there is thin mucus, for example, a bacteria get entrapped into the mucus and cilia are also present in bronchus, then what happens that cilia move, and that movement of cilia removes the entrapped bacteria from that thin mucus. Okay, but whenever there is thick mucus, this cilia flattens. This cilia cannot move in thick mucus. So whenever the bacteria gets into the mucus, that bacteria remains entrapped within the mucus, and that bacteria then causes infection. Whenever there is infection, there is inflammation. Okay, I hope that you know the steps of inflammation, but the last step of inflammation, let me revise it for you, that whenever there is inflammation, so what happens, there is a swelling, and after some time you get your skin back to the normal. What happens that the last step of inflammation is that fibroblasts invade at the site of inflammation and they deposit collagen. Whenever they deposit collagen, your skin gets back to the normal. Okay, whenever there is more and more infection, there is more and more inflammation, so there is more and more deposition of collagen, and instead of forming a normal tissue, that collagen becomes a scar tissue. Okay, so that scar tissue is basically that again and again deposition of collagen by the fibroblast, and that formation of scar tissue, that is termed as fibrosis. Okay, that is why we are using the terms fibrosis over here, that bacteria gets entrapped within the mucus, it causes infection, inflammation, and ultimately leads to fibrosis. Got it? In case of pancreas, what happens is that, for example, I have a pancreas over here, okay, and this pancreas is basically, it has a pancreatic duct which is going into the small intestine. This is small intestine, this is pancreas, and here we have a pancreatic duct. What happens that this pancreatic duct is also lined with mucus. Okay, so suppose here is the mucus. Whenever there is cystic fibrosis, there is so much mucus over here, there is a thick mucus, so this pancreatic duct gets blocked. So pancreas, what pancreas has to do? Pancreas has to release the enzymes, okay, pancreatic enzymes. So pancreatic enzymes cannot be released, and those pancreatic enzymes will not reach into the small intestine. So what is the effect of cystic fibrosis on pancreas? That pancreatic enzymes will not be released into small intestine due to blockage of pancreatic duct by this thick mucus, okay. And in case of testes, whenever there is genetic cystic fibrosis, then those children do not have vas deferens. We have observed in the patient of cystic fibrosis, in children from the start, they don't have vas deferens. So whenever they don't have vas deferens, that leads to infertility of male. Okay, so these are some important things you have to remember. You have to remember about lungs. It causes pulmonary or chronic infections, and in case of pancreas, there is no release of pancreatic enzymes. So this is all about the biochemical basis of cystic fibrosis. Now, what is the treatment of this disease? How can we cure the disease? Basically, this disease can be cured by two ways. Firstly, there must be the supplementation of the pancreatic enzymes, because as you know, the pancreatic duct is blocked. So we must give patients these pancreatic enzymes or supplements which may act to help digestion of lipids, because you know the pancreatic enzymes, they are rich in pancreatic lipase, cholesterol, esterase that are responsible for the fats absorption. So whenever there is blockage, whenever there is no pancreatic enzyme, so that will lead to the cystic fibrosis, that will lead to the no absorption of fats. So we must give supplementation of these important enzymes. Second most important thing we have to do for the cystic fibrosis patient is that we have to give them the fat soluble vitamins. Why we have to give them fat soluble vitamins? Because as I told you earlier, that there is no release of pancreatic enzymes, there is no release of pancreatic lipase. Whenever there is no pancreatic lipase, there will be no absorption of fat soluble vitamins. Okay, so that absorption of fats will lead to deficiency of fat soluble vitamins. Okay, and fat soluble vitamins are very important. These are A, D, E and K. Okay, so whenever there is no fat absorption, it means there is no absorption of fat soluble vitamins. Then we have to supply these fat soluble vitamins. Also, what happens in case of cystic fibrosis, there is no pancreatic lipase. I'm more focusing on in pancreas. Okay, so whenever there is no pancreatic lipase, there will be no absorption of fats, and no absorption of fats will lead to more excretion of fats. Fats will directly be excreted out, and increased excretion, the condition will termed as steatorrhea. Okay, so what is the treatment? Firstly, we have to give them the pancreatic enzymes that will help in absorption of fats. Secondly, we have to give them fat soluble vitamins, because as there is no pancreatic lipase, that will lead to malabsorption of fat soluble vitamins. So we have to give them exogenous fat soluble vitamins. And then as there is no pancreatic lipase, so there will be more excretion of fats, and that will lead to a condition, more excretion of fats and less absorption of fats. The condition is termed as steatorrhea. So this is all for cystic fibrosis. I hope that you have got the lecture. If you have got the lecture, please like the video, subscribe to my YouTube channel. See you in the next video. Allah Hafiz.